Hello, everyone. This is just kind of right. Hi. We're so excited. So my name is Anya Samek, and I've been working on this project since the very beginning. And ever since we started talking to Templeton about our idea, the very first thing we said is one thing that's missing in a lot of research, but especially in the sector in philanthropy, is that we don't bring together researchers and practitioners, and we don't have a clear line for research to be put into practice. And I had, at that time, just gone to a conference on financial literacy, where people who are my colleagues now at the University of Wisconsin-Madison had tried to bring together professionals from the financial sector with researchers from the financial literacy sector. And that conference was a great success. They had about 40 people at that conference, and I said, that's what we should do. And so we said, if we can get 40 people, 20 researchers and 20 practitioners to come, I'll consider that a success. And we have 140 people in attendance today, which I should be clapping, because this is great for us, and I hope it'll be great for you. So what I'm going to talk about today, and mainly we see practitioners here, is I'm going to give you an overview of what behavioral economics is and why we really need experiments. Hopefully, John List earlier has given you some ideas already about how interested we are in the partnership. And my job will be to lead you through how to interpret some of the talks for the day. So please stop me if you have any questions. And once we're done with this section, then Michael Price will be leading a panel of practitioners who have already done some research using experiments, and they'll be speaking about their views on that. All right. Oh, this doesn't work. All right, so today I have 3 big questions, and hopefully we'll have 3 big answers from this conference. So I'll tell you in the next 30 minutes, as quickly as I can, but as clearly as I can, what is behavioral economics, and why do we need experiments? And this 3rd big question, that's going to be up to all of you. So how can SPY insights be applied? The idea is that as you come and listen to all of these talks, you think about how you can apply some of these ideas in your organization, and then you come and you speak to the researchers and you talk to them about your interests. So yesterday I had met a couple of my colleagues who are researchers, and they said, so we heard there are going to be practitioners at this conference, and we're really interested in talking to them, but how do we do it? What questions should we ask them? Do they have challenges that they're facing that we can help answer? And I said, yes, please talk to them, and I'll be telling them to talk to you. And I think some of our researchers are as scared of talking to practitioners as practitioners might be scared about some of the jargon that we use. So I'm hoping through this conference we can break those barriers. All right, so behavioral economics. I have 1 slide on this. Our main idea is that decisions are not random. So donors don't randomly go and say, flip a coin and say, do I donate or not? We believe that people behave in predictable ways defined by 2 things. The first thing is constraints. So what can individuals do? And in the world of philanthropy, we think about how much money do these people have? We make predictions about their income, and then we learn about the constraints. Then we have this other part, preferences. What is it that the individual wants to do? And what we expect to happen, and what we predict as economists, is that people are going to make decisions to maximize their satisfaction. And we call satisfaction utility. So that's going to be one of the jargon words you might need to know, because people say it all the time thinking everybody else knows it. But utility just means satisfaction. It's just a numerical way of explaining satisfaction. And that can include things like how much money I have, how much happiness I have, how much happiness I get out of certain things. And they maximize this utility based on preferences. And they need to remain within their constraints. So they can't give an unlimited amount of money to your charity if they don't have an unlimited amount of money to give. What we're really interested in as behavioral economists is really figuring out what those preferences are. So what makes people have greater satisfaction or greater utility? So here's an example of how we might think about George getting a solicitation letter. So we might think George is going to carefully read the letter. He's going to think about whether the charity that wrote the letter deserves a donation. He'll think about how much money he has, that's his constraint. And if he has enough money and the charity looks pretty good, he writes a check. That's how we'd like the world to work because it'll be really straightforward. But here's what might happen. So George glances at this letter. He gets a lot of other letters in the mail. He doesn't have time to read past the first sentence, and he puts it aside. He thinks a lot or a little about his own satisfaction from the donation. So we expect that people should gain happiness or satisfaction from giving. He's going to think about that. Probably going to think about what his friends are doing. Do his friends give to that charity? Does he know anyone else who gives to that charity? He might think about how he might feel guilty if he doesn't give. So I get a lot of these letters from the March of Dimes, and I'm constantly getting dimes. And I feel really bad if I don't give to the March of Dimes because they've sent me a dime. That's actually one reason I give, not because I read a lot about that charity online and know a lot about how effective they are, but because I have a difference in my satisfaction if I don't give. And that's called self-interest. So we're very interested in our own feelings from giving, not so much about what the charity is going to benefit. And then finally, he's going to think about what the charity will do with the money. And so as economists, we've got some econ jargon for all this. So we think there's a big transaction cost to reading the letter. So reading a letter is not costless. I could be doing something else with my time. And so we want to think about those kinds of things. This whole part about thinking about my own satisfaction, one thing that we talk a lot about is called warm glow. Warm glow is the idea that people get satisfaction just from the act of giving. And cold prickle, so feeling guilty that they didn't give. We also will talk a lot about framing. So the letter is going to tell him something about how he should act. And it's going to do that based on various social norms you might portray in the letter. So a lot of the talks that you'll see will be about social norms. So a lot of campaigns where we tell people, oh, others in your neighborhood gave this amount. And those kinds of social norms really drive behavior. And then finally, he thinks about what the charity will do with the money. That's pure altruism. So purely altruistic people give because they want to help the charity, because for them, their satisfaction depends on how well off the people will be that the charity is helping. On the other hand, warm glow is more about how I feel after I give. So what we're really interested in as behavioral economists is actually thinking about how all of these different underpinnings of decision making affect whether someone will give or not. And so what is behavioral economics? In these 5 minutes that I've told you about it, it's really learning about the underpinnings of human behavior and learning about people's preferences and using that knowledge to predict how people will behave in different environments. In this case, the different environments we're thinking about are different types of solicitations that charities might send out or different types of volunteer opportunities that charities might give potential volunteers. And hopefully then we're going to provide insights into which environments to apply to obtain the desired results. So do we send a letter to George that tells him about what his friends are giving? Do we send him a letter with a dime in it to make him feel bad if he doesn't respond? What are the best strategies and how can we harness behavioral economics to actually increase giving? So now we get to the data. This is a science experiment this guy is doing. It looks like he may have been successful. We also run experiments in the social sciences. And we do that in the lab, and we do that also in the field. When we say we run an experiment with the field, that's when we partner with charities and work with actual real donors. In the lab, we work with undergraduate students, and we remove the context and make an environment that's very, very controlled. When we work with undergraduate students, I always get told, well, you're not working with real people. And I have to tell them undergraduate students are real people. We have some sitting right here in the front today. They're helping with the conference. All right, so why do we need experiments? We can collect big data. Big data is really popular right now. Many of you have so much data with your charity, you may not know how to analyze it. And data will tell us what people actually do in different environments. We can learn about human behavior. We can learn a lot from real data. But big data doesn't always tell the whole story. We need to know what causes certain behaviors so we can generate insights into how solicitations work. And that's what experiments do. Experiments are really good at giving us causal inference. So let me show you what I mean. Here's one example. Suppose I'm a researcher and I go and I talk to a CEO of a firm and they tell me our ads work because the more ads we use, the more clients we have. And that's a causal relationship. We just have to keep putting out ads and we're going to get more clientele. And then I can respond and say, I think ice cream is dangerous because the more ice cream we eat, the more drownings occur. And that's actually a real relationship in the data. Whenever ice cream sales go up, drownings also go up. We're missing something key here, which is that most of the time that people eat ice cream, they're also eating it by the pool in the summer. So what we're missing here is what we call an omitted variable. There's something in this data that's causing drownings to occur, and it's not ice cream. I could use this ice cream example to tell people, hey, we should stop serving ice cream at all pools because they cause drownings. And we could remove these ice creams, but nothing would happen. And that's why causation is so important. We need causation so that we can say clearly that if we remove these ice creams, we're going to get a difference in behavior. And with this CEO example, we also have an omitted variable. It's the fact that the firm is doing well, they have the money for advertisements, and they put out more advertisements. Or the firm is doing well because the market is doing well, and so more clients are choosing to respond to these advertisements.
Or they advertise twice as much in December as they do the rest of the year.
Thank you. Or they advertise much more during high peak seasons, and they never take into account these omitted variables. So ice cream doesn't cause drownings. Solicitation, good. I'm glad I like ice cream too. Solicitation letters don't always cause an improvement in donor responses. We have to think about the omitted variables. And experiments can do that. So what we need is we need this guy. We throw an apple at him, and we see a cause and effect relationship. We throw the apple, he falls down. We see that he's fallen. What we need is we need a counterfactual. So we need to have another guy just like him at whom we don't throw an apple. And then we can compare these two guys. That's really hard to do. You can never do that. You can never have a guy who's gotten an apple thrown at him and also not have an apple thrown at him at the same time. So what we do instead is we use what's called randomization. And randomization sounds like a fancy term. All we mean is that we take a bunch of people, and possibly their potential donors, and we randomly allocate some of them to receive a particular solicitation and some of them to receive some other solicitation. And when we do that, and we have a large enough number of donors, we assume that on average, donors in solicitation type A are similar to donors in solicitation type B. So we have a bunch of people who have an apple thrown at them and a bunch of people who look very similar at whom we don't throw an apple. And that's when we can clearly say that the relationship is causal. So the relationship is caused by the apple, or it's caused by the solicitation. So we've got here a little town. We have houses here. We actually do this a lot. Some of my Wisconsin students have been making a lot of maps for door-to-door solicitations, and we randomly put this group of houses, and all of these. We put them into different categories, and then we assign. This is a simple experiment where some people get a solicitation which also has a matching grant, and some of them don't. And we assume that these no-match guys are quite similar to these match guys. And we know some information about them as well. We have some average data about income in this area and the price of housing and so on. So those are two more jargon words. We have randomize, and we have treatments. A treatment is just a particular environment that we set up for a donor. In this case, the match is a treatment, and the no match is a different treatment. This is a field experiment because we go out into the field, we randomize households to different groups, and then we give them different treatments. So a couple of jargon words here. You'll hear that word treatment quite a lot. So what's the expertise from the research side of running a field experiment? We can help design the study. We can think a lot about the solicitation message and a lot about these different types of what we call incentives, so different reasons that we can give people to get them to donate. Things like match rates, seed money, and things that are non-monetary like recognition, so recognizing people for their actions. We then think about randomizing and making sure there is balance. So one thing we want to think about when we say the word balance is that the people in one treatment are quite similar to the people in another treatment based on many characteristics. Often these are going to be their past donations. And then we can help draw conclusions. So we don't leave the charity with all this data sitting around. We come back and we look at the data, we compare the rate of giving and the average gift by treatment. We can infer causation from this type of approach, and we can help to gain insights. But we also need expertise from the practitioners. You know best about your donor base, and you know best about what challenges you're facing. And as I said before, as researchers, we're very interested in knowing what those are, because we're coming from this theory side and thinking about these underpinnings of why people give. We know less about your particular donor base. You have expertise in the art of asking, so you have many years of experience of doing this. We'd like to work together to learn about what that experience is. And you are the only one who can bring research into practice. So I can't possibly go out and raise money if I don't have a charity. We'd love to work with practitioners on that. People often have reservations about running a field experiment. So the first thing I often get asked is, but not everyone's going to get this new solicitation. We've come up with this new idea. We want everybody to get this new solicitation so that we can immediately reap the benefits. But it's okay not to give everyone the new solicitation. In an experiment, we always have to give someone a control version of the solicitation because we need to learn about the actual return to the new solicitation. We need to learn about the causal effect and the magnitude of that effect. And also, if something doesn't work, we didn't send it out to the entire pool of donors. That can be kind of important too. And causal knowledge is going to help us have more knowledge to move forward and make scientifically informed decisions about how to get donors to give. So that's field experiments. When you go to talks that are about field experiments, those will be more straightforward, I think, to follow because they'll be working with a charity and running treatments where they vary these different letters, either a mailing or an email or a door-to-door solicitation. Now let me get to the other type of experiment that we have. We also have laboratory experiments, and we have these undergraduate student subjects. They come into a lab that looks like this up here. We have these computers. This is the lab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And typically the games are on the computer. And they play different types of games. They can be what we call one-shot, which means that you just make one decision and then you leave. Or they can be many periods or repeated games in which you make several decisions over and over again and we look at how behavior changes over time. One thing we do is that we remove the context and we make a very controlled environment. And laboratory experiments can be really good for us to really understand how does recognition work? Or how does an incentive work? How does a particular type of information work at changing behavior? It can be easier to do than in the field, and it can often also be a first step before we even run a field experiment. All right. Again, in the lab, we're going to have treatments. So if you go to a lab talk, you'll hear people say, we had treatments. They often say we had a 2x2 design. That means they varied two things on one side and two things on another side. Each treatment is just changing one aspect of the environment. It's very controlled. We just change one small thing, and then we observe causation. Again, we have randomization. This time, instead of randomly putting different houses into treatments, what we're doing is just every time people come in, we're running some other treatment. We don't tell people what it is before they arrive in the lab, And so just based on the time you decide to show up for one of these experiments, you're then randomly put into one of these environments. And again, that means that if we observe a difference in behavior between different treatments, that's going to be caused by the treatment and not by some other characteristic of the donor or some other omitted variable that we didn't see. So this is an example of a very common type of game that people play in the lab, and it's called a public goods game. So in this public goods game, I've got these 5 players here, and each of them are going to be making a decision about 80 experimental dollars. In this case, the dollars are later transferred into real money. So they're actually going to walk away at the end of the experiment with some real money. Real money is at stake, and these experiments really can tell us a lot about how people make decisions. So I have these 5 guys. They each decide, do I donate to the public good, or do they keep my money in my private account? Everyone is better off if the entire group donates to the public good. However, if I choose not to donate my tokens to the public good, I can still benefit from all of the possible benefits of the public good without having to pay the cost. And everyone actually has this incentive. That's their self-interest part. So people who are very self-interested might choose to just keep all their money. But we do see that people are altruistic in these environments and generous, and they actually do choose to give some of their money to this public good. And we like to use this public goods game because it's a classic way for us to put people in a dilemma. So the subject arrives in the lab, he has this dilemma. How much do I want to share with the others, and how much do I want to keep? But we're not just interested in studying how much people keep in these environments. This is where we start adding treatments and making changes. What is this guy thinking? This guy's thinking, no one will know if I keep it for myself. So this guy, he keeps everything for himself and reaps the benefits of this public good. Okay. So this is a mini example of one of the experiments that I've run before. And it's looking at this very question, this no one will know if I keep it for myself. We're looking at recognition. So we bring people to a lab, and we have 4 different treatments. We have a treatment in which everyone is anonymous to one another. There's 5 people in the group. Over a time of 20 periods, they decide every time, do I keep the money for myself, which is my self-interested incentive, or do I donate it to the public group and share it with everyone? Then I have this treatment on the very far right. In this one, I actually take a photo of every person who comes into the lab, and they have to hold up their name card, and then every time they give or choose to keep, everyone in their group gets to see what they did. So this is the recognition part. Then I have 2 more treatments. So what I suspect will happen is once I show everybody their picture, people are going to be much less likely to free ride or to decide to keep the money for themselves. But what I'm really interested in is I'm interested in this question of prestige versus shame. So what I mean is, in this top one, in this treatment, only the top 2 donors ever have their photo shown to the group. So if I care about the prestige of being a top donor, I'm going to want to give a lot in this treatment so my photo can be shown to everybody else. But this treatment, this is kind of the fun treatment. So in this treatment, I show the bottom 2 donors. These are the people who give nothing to the public good or give very small amounts. And if I'm worried about having a negative image to the rest of the group, and if I'm going to feel shame of being the lowest contributor, this is the treatment where I'm going to want to donate a lot so I don't end up in this low category. And so here I'm actually trying to learn about what happens when you make people visible to each other instead of anonymous. How does recognition work, social recognition? And also, what's the difference between prestige and shame in this particular environment? So I'll get straight to the results. This shows the percentage of the number of tokens that they started out with on the y-axis and the number of periods on the x-axis. And I won't go into details, but typically in these games we see people starting out at about half of their endowment being contributed to the public good and then some decrease. The first thing we see is that once I make people visible to each other, everyone jumps up and gives a lot more. I think that's pretty expected. So now we're going to vote, and I'd like to see who thinks that the prestige is going to work better and who thinks the shame is going to work better. So who's for prestige? And who's for shame? All right. So let's see. So there's prestige. Prestige is actually only slightly better, and we say often not significantly better, we do some data analysis, than not showing photos at all. So in this particular environment, prestige didn't matter quite so much. Now shame, guys, there we go. What we find here is that shame increases contributions to the same level as recognizing everyone. Now this was a really surprising finding for us because when we started out, we never ran the shame treatment. We ran the prestige treatment first, thinking charities always recognize top donors. This has got to work really well. People are going to compete to be right there at the top. But they're not. So we have this conclusion. First of all, recognition by peers is very effective. So once we tell people who everybody is that's giving, that really works. Shame is very relevant for this environment, and prestige less so. Now this particular environment is special for a reason. It's special because we don't have entry and exit. So you can't just exit completely and never be recognized. So we need to explore some additional environments. But one point is that prestige and shame, these are two underpinnings of why people give that we've discovered in a lab now that we can think about testing in the field setting. Very carefully though, because we don't want to shame our donors. Now my last slide, so how can SPY insights be applied? You're going to learn about some behavioral economics. You're going to learn about experiments that help us to make better predictions. And then we'd like you to think about how you're changing your donors from a no to a yes, and how you can work with us on some of these questions. So we hope you ask a lot of questions. Please approach the researchers if they're not approaching you. They might be scared. I was surprised to learn that they were, but some of us have never talked to people in the real world. And thank you very much. So I think we either can ask some questions now, or we can go straight to the panel, whatever you prefer.
Anya, is it possible to have experiments without randomization?
So that it's possible to think about ways to infer causation using naturally occurring data without running an experiment. And it's also possible to think about ways in which the real-world environment has already given you randomization. But it's not possible to have an experiment unless there's a component of randomization
If I
there.
bring subjects into a public goods game, I'm interested in studying do they free ride. Is that not an experiment? I'm
No.
not doing any treatments.
It is an experiment, but you're learning, and you can do that, and I think in that case you're going to learn about preferences. But with randomization, you can learn more about different types of environments that affect behavior. So you're right. So you could just bring people in a lab and just learn about preferences. We do that as well, actually. So we learn about time preferences and social preferences in that way.
But the key message here is, if we want to learn what causes what,
Then we
to make
need-
sure
yes.
that whatever we're doing is completely independent of any other variables that might be affecting behavior. And
That's right.
that's why experiments are so valuable for causality.
Yes.
Is there a general process that you go through, like one would do a field experiment and then a lab experiment and then make a conclusion? Do they ever happen in tandem?
They often happen in, sure. So the question is whether there's a general process for lab and field. And I would say that some people tend to do lab experiments more than others, and some people in our field tend to do field experiments more. One good way for them to work together is to start out in a lab experiment setting, because you don't want to right away bring in thousands of donors and expose them to some environment you've never tested before. So a good way is really to start with a lab experiment, learn about what works, and then bring it to the field. Yep.
What kind of groups, what makes a statistically valid size? Because one of the things I'm thinking about is testing some things with some higher level donors. And
Mhm.
of course, you have constraints about you just don't have as
That's right. So what we do a lot in research is what's called power tests. Many of you have maybe heard of this. And the idea is we think about the effect size that we expect, and then the effect size is going to dictate the number of donors that you need. So if you expect a very large effect, you can have fewer donors. If you expect a very small effect, you need a lot of donors to find a statistically significant effect. So it's very dependent on your environment, and there are statistical tests that you do to determine the optimal sample size.
Could you, if you were going to, let's say, be a large institution, go into a capital campaign, you always assume your donors have given you money for a certain reason because of your mission or whatever it happens to be, and you start into that campaign, as happens many times, and all of a sudden you hit a brick wall because nothing is happening, they're not responding, they're not giving, the economy's good, all those things are right, but nothing is happening. Could you, before you went into that campaign, do a test, actually do an experiment of sample groups, both laboratory and field, to make sure, first of all, that they are relating to your mission, because you're running into that problem, but that they understand what they're giving to, and they understand what it is, that you understand what it is you actually have in terms of constituency.
Yes, so we encourage you to do experiments. And I think if you had a large enough subsample, you could do that and actually find significant effects of interest. And hopefully during this conference you can learn more about different ways to overcome these brick walls and get people more engaged.
So if Madison wanted to do, with the University of Wisconsin, a capital campaign for $3 billion, and you think people are going to give to that campaign, before you even started that, it would be worth taking 6 months to a year and doing the experiments first to make sure you're focusing in the right areas to do that capital campaign.
Sure, I think so. Hopefully if Madison does that, they'll ask me first. Maybe
Well,
I
I
can.
would.
But I think the key for some of these talks today, as you'll see, is what we're finding is that some of these things that really don't relate to the mission of the charity are what really matters to drive behavior. So one thing that we're thinking about testing with Booth, actually with their alumni, is looking at ways for them to connect with current students and get them more engaged by giving them some social information. So we're actually giving them this opportunity that for every amount they give, one current student will receive a gift from Booth. And so the idea is to engage people in new ways. So not just thinking about crafting the message about our mission as best as we can, but thinking about new behavioral ways that we can drive giving. And here what we're doing is decreasing the social distance between these potential donors that we have and the current students at Booth, and helping them to think about, oh, how was my experience at Booth? Can I help a student there who's there now? And so the idea is to come up with new behavioral ways to do that, not spend a lot of time doing focus groups to learn about what's the right wording of sentence 17 on my page, because as we see, people often, that's what's often most relevant to people, is kind of what's my self-interested or what's my utility-driven reason for giving.
I was going to say, I think it would be an awesome takeaway, and that may not happen at the conference, but the long term is, I think a lot of nonprofits care about campaigns. Usually it's derived from focus group activity, which may not yield, may be false starts, may be insignificant in the long term, and to think about the types of tools that can be created that sort of get past that really get to core issues about our messages, getting through, how are we addressing donors, where they're at. I think that would be a huge takeaway that I think would, ambitious it might be, but it would be a great tool to have.
So you're saying it's common to do a focus group before you launch the campaign, just with guides
Yeah,
on
I
how
think-
you're designing the campaign?
Yeah, we kind of fly it and sort of build it at the same time. And what we usually, again, there's obviously a little bit more sophistication there, but for the most part, I think we find that whatever we had originally thought it was right, it wasn't right. And so I think to have better tools to be able to assess early on, to better test what we think might be right, we could use more of it. And I think that's where researchers who can translate some of the data and learn to help us learn some of the lessons perhaps, and that would be very helpful.
would be interesting to hear examples where you thought you'd learned something from a focus group and then it turned out you didn't really learn it after
Yeah.
all. Because we economists tend to think people's actions speak louder than their words. So if you get people into a focus group and they say, yeah, this is what I think, sometimes that's not actually how they end up behaving.
Yeah.
One reason we like to run these experiments is
Yeah, and that's,
is to see
exactly.
how do people actually open their checkbooks.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think Dave raised a very good point here, and that is in other areas in environmental damage assessment and involving surveys, not charitable giving, people have replaced classical focus groups, which is just flapping your gums, with somebody who's encouraging you to flap them in this direction or that direction,
Yeah.
with lab experiments, the controlled stuff, as well as asking the questions in the field. So you're doing some controlled lab experiments, so you get exactly what David's saying, you see if is their money or their choice where their mouth is, as well as the broader field, context, and reference. So it's going to that earlier question of the complementarity between surveys, lab experiments, focus groups, and the field experiments. It's a continuum.
Well, it goes back to what John said earlier about, it all remains static for what, 30 years. Why is that? Because the donor base is changing. We know it's changing out there. We know people are giving for different reasons. They have different motivations because they're different people than they were. One in the manufacturing sector, they're the tech sector. Some of those people don't give. Why don't they? I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on that we can't get our arms around. I know that. And that a lab experiment might be more pertinent to what we're doing than a field experiment in this case. And definitely more pertinent than a focus group, I guarantee that, because those are really tedious.
So this is really good because we've now started talking about applying these experiments, and it's a good segue into our next panel that Michael Price will be leading with some practitioners who have actually done this. So I'm going to turn that over to Mike. So thanks very much, and I'll be around. I'll be around during the break and all day today and tomorrow, and I'd love to talk with all